It is April 1945. A spring wind blows across a liberated subcamp near Ohrdruf, Germany, carrying a stench so thick it stains the throat. Hundreds of emaciated corpses lie in open pits, some shot, some starved, others charred black by fire. American soldiers stand frozen, vomiting into the mud, their faces streaked with tears and grease. Then the silence breaks. 5 German guards crawl from a concrete bunker with their hands raised, their screams for mercy cutting through the heavy air. On the ground nearby, 2 other guards lie motionless in the dirt, fresh bullet holes pooling in their skulls. A 3rd guard gasps his last breath, his chest torn open by a point-blank round. An American captain struggles in the mud, pinning his own veteran sergeant to the ground to stop a total massacre. General George S. Patton will answer this breakdown of discipline with a judgment that forces his men to look into the mirror of their own actions. This is the story of what happened when an American combat unit discovered an extermination camp and took justice into their own hands, pushing their commanders to the absolute edge of military law. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the silence that screamed louder than any shell. Captain Warren Tate was a 30-year-old company commander from Seattle, Washington, serving in the frontline infantry. He had spent months leading his men through the frozen, blood-soaked mud of Western Europe, watching his unit take heavy casualties at every crossroads and river crossing. Before the war, Tate had been a straight-backed high school teacher, a man who believed in the absolute stability of rules, legal boundaries, and the Geneva Convention. The grueling combat had aged him, leaving him with deep lines around his eyes and a constant, heavy tremor in his left hand from an artillery blast outside Aachen. He had lost his younger brother to a sniper just 3 weeks prior, an event that nearly broke his spirit, but he forced himself to remain an anchor of discipline for his remaining soldiers. On this damp April afternoon, Tate stood at the rusted iron gates of the Ohrdruf subcamp, his boots sunk in the mud, trying desperately to maintain his military bearing while his entire world fractured around him. Staff Sergeant Raymond Holt was a 28-year-old veteran from Memphis, Tennessee, who had survived 14 continuous months of brutal, close-quarters combat without a single infraction on his record. He was a hardened tactical leader, trusted blindly by his squad, but he carried a deep, simmering rage after witnessing the systematic slaughter of his closest friends across France and Germany. Holt possessed the unearned privilege of survival in a platoon where almost everyone else had been buried, and he wore a clean, captured leather jacket over his standard olive drab uniform. He believed that the enemy had forfeited their right to exist, frequently telling his men that the fields of Germany needed to be cleared like weeds. When his boots crossed into the compound, and the true scale of the camp's mass graves met his eyes, something inside his mind snapped completely. He drew his standard-issue service pistol, walked directly past his commanding officer, and leveled the barrel at the foreheads of the surrendering guards. By April 1945, the Allied armies were racing across central Germany, tearing through the final, desperate defenses of a collapsing empire. The German military apparatus was fracturing into chaos, leaving hundreds of thousands of prisoners abandoned in a vast network of hidden camps. As the front lines shifted deeper into the countryside, advance reconnaissance units began stumbling into these remote clearings, discovering horrors that no combat training could possibly prepare them to face. Many field commanders found themselves occupying liberated zones without immediate orders from high command, forced to manage starving populations, hidden partisan networks, and surrendering enemy guards all at the same time. The sheer speed of the American advance had outpaced the arrival of military government teams, creating a dangerous authority vacuum where individual temperaments dictated the application of justice. In dozens of towns across the region, combat fatigue mixed with sudden, overwhelming grief as soldiers pulled back the curtains on systematic murder. Some field officers looked away when their men beat captured camp staff, while others actively participated in the immediate execution of guard detachments. The rules of engagement, carefully maintained during standard operations, began to dissolve under the weight of what the liberators were digging out of the earth. The High Command issued strict warnings about prisoner safety, but the physical reality on the ground made compliance nearly impossible for men who had spent over a year dodging artillery shells. The line between legal execution and flat-out murder became thinner with every mile the tanks pushed forward into the heart of the regime. Tate knew that the reports of these unofficial retaliations were filtering up the chain, but he had never expected the breakdown to happen inside his own company area. Now, the smoking pistols in the mud forced a complete halt to the advance. Captain Tate marched across the camp yard, his hand resting hard on his service holster to stop the shaking. Sergeant Holt stood over the groaning, bloody forms of the guards, his eyes completely bloodshot, his weapon still raised. Tate grabbed Holt by the shoulder and pulled him back with a violent jerk. Holt did not lower the weapon. He turned his face toward Tate, his teeth bared, his entire body trembling under his grease-stained uniform. "Put the gun down, Sergeant," Tate said. "Look at what they did, Captain," Holt answered. "Look at the pits. Look at the barracks. They are not men." Tate stepped directly into Holt's line of fire, his chest inches from the pistol muzzle. "I see it, Sergeant, but we have a procedure for prisoners, and you are violating a direct order." "They did not use a procedure on those children," Holt said, his voice rising as he gestured toward the open mass graves behind the wire. "They burned them alive. They starved them until their bones cut through their skin. 2 minutes ago, these bastards were holding the rifles. Now they hold their hands up and expect us to feed them. We are the United States Army, Holt," Tate said, keeping his voice steady despite the bile rising in his throat. "We do not shoot men who have surrendered, no matter what they did before we walked through that gate. Lower the weapon and step back right now." Holt shook his head, his finger tightening on the trigger guard. "You were not in the trenches at St. Lo, Captain. You did not watch the platoon get chewed to pieces while these camp bastards sat in their clean quarters. They do not get a trial. They do not get a lawyer. They get exactly what they gave." Corporal Briggs stepped up beside Holt, his own rifle raised and leveled at the remaining 5 guards, screaming in the mud. "The sergeant is right, Captain. If we do not kill them, the lawyers will just let them go home to their farms in a year." Tate did not hesitate. He lunged forward, throwing his entire weight into Holt and hitting the muddy ground in a tangle of limbs. The pistol discharged into the air as they fell. Tate pinned Holt's arms down, screaming for his medics to disarm Briggs and secure the surviving prisoners in the main guardhouse. The camp area devolved into a shouting match of furious soldiers, weeping survivors, and trembling prisoners. Tate scrambled to his feet, his uniform soaked in filth, and pointed at his radio operator. "Get 3rd Army headquarters on the line immediately. Tell them we have a breakdown of discipline at the Liberation site." The urgent report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked into the subcamp unannounced, his boots snapping against the frozen earth as his staff officers struggled to keep pace. The shouting stopped instantly. The dirty infantrymen stood at rigid attention, their eyes fixed on the cold profile of the Army commander. Patton did not raise his voice. He walked directly toward the guardhouse, where the 5 surviving German guards sat against the timber wall, then turned his gaze to Holt and Briggs, who stood under armed guard. Patton studied Holt. The general's voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent yard. "Did you fire these shots, Sergeant?" "I did, General," Holt said, staring straight ahead. "Did these prisoners offer physical resistance after you entered the wire?" "No, sir," Holt answered. "Were they under the control of an officer when you pulled your trigger?" "They were surrendering to us, General," Holt said, his jaw tightening. "But you have not seen the trenches behind the barracks. They are murderers." Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I understand what you saw, Sergeant. I have seen it myself. Every man who walks into this camp and looks into those pits wants to do exactly what you did. The smell makes the stomach turn. The sight makes the blood boil. But we do not shoot men who have raised their hands, because the moment we execute prisoners, we become them. We do not become them in degree. but we become them in kind. We cross a line that separates a soldier from a butcher. You have a choice, Sergeant. You and Corporal Briggs will face a general court-martial for violation of the laws of war, or you will accept the field judgment I impose on this company today. Decide now. Holt looked at the ground, then back at the general's stone face. We will take your judgment, sir. Patton turned his head toward the company commander. Captain Tate, you stopped a total massacre today. You were just as angry as your men. Your brother was killed by the enemy 3 weeks ago. Yet you held the line. That is the difference between justice and revenge. Your discipline saved the honor of this command. Patton looked back at the rest of the gathered company, his hand resting near his ivory grip. This line is absolute. We will find more horrors as we push deeper into Germany. We will want vengeance. But we will choose justice instead. That choice is what makes us different from the beast we are hunting down. Patton ordered the immediate assembly of the entire company in the center of the muddy compound, forcing them to stand in a wide circle directly facing the shallow burial trenches. Under the sharp gaze of the military police, Staff Sergeant Holt and Corporal Briggs were handed standard-issue entrenching shovels and ordered to step down into the cold muck. Their punishment was to physically exhume, carry, and prepare each desecrated victim for a proper, dignified military burial, working alongside the very German guards they had spared. For 12 continuous hours without a single break for rations, the 2 American soldiers labored in the freezing rain, their hands raw and bleeding from the rough wooden handles. They smelled the heavy stench of decay, felt the crushing weight of the systematic murder, and looked into the dead faces of the people they had failed to protect from brutality. The surviving German guards worked directly beside them, shivering in their green uniforms, forced to bear the physical weight of the crimes their regime had committed. The infantrymen of the company watched the grim spectacle in total silence, the initial desire for immediate vengeance fading into a deep, sobering understanding of what real justice required. By midnight, the lines of bodies were covered in clean white sheets, and the cycle of unauthorized executions within the division was completely broken. Captain Tate returned to Seattle, Washington, after the victory in Europe, carrying the heavy memory of his brother and the grim reality of the camps back to his civilian life. He went back to the classroom, teaching history to generations of young students with a quiet, intense focus on the absolute necessity of legal boundaries and institutional discipline. He never spoke to his colleagues about the day he tackled his own sergeant in the mud, but his left hand continued to shake whenever the spring rain hit the school windows. Tate lived a long, private life as a respected community leader until his death in 1983. Staff Sergeant Raymond Holt was reduced in rank following the field investigation, but was allowed to remain with the division through the occupation period, his spotless combat record sparing him from a federal penitentiary. He returned to Memphis, Tennessee in late 1945, landing a job as a mechanic and maintaining a strict, unbroken silence regarding his time in the European theater. The anger that had consumed him at the camp gates slowly hardened into a quiet, permanent withdrawal from public life, and he passed away quietly in his sleep in 1991. General Patton never included the specific details of the Ohrdruf executions in his public addresses or his standard press briefings, choosing instead to file the formal disciplinary action away in his personal records. He did, however, note the incident in a private letter to his wife, writing that the hardest part of the campaign was forcing men who had witnessed absolute evil to remain civilized. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to grant clemency and substitute standard court-martial trials with immediate physical labor undermined the formal system of military justice. They contend that executing captured guards under any circumstances is a clear violation of the Geneva Convention that required a swift, severe prison sentence to maintain Allied legal superiority. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the extreme emotional provocation of the camp discovery necessitated an immediate, localized response to prevent a complete mutiny among the frontline troops. They claim that forcing the men to bury the dead achieved a deeper moral calibration than any distant courtroom ever could. What is certain is that Patton's handling of the Ohrdruf incident established an absolute precedent across the entire Third Army, ensuring that the final advance into the heart of Germany remained a campaign of strict justice rather than a series of uncoordinated massacres. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have pressed forward with a full court-martial, regardless of the emotional shock? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.